You know what sucks? What sucks is when there's something that you think sucks, but everyone else thinks it's great, so you have to be the one sourpuss who doesn't love the so-called great thing that actually sucks. But you know what also sucks? What also sucks is when something was great and everyone thought it was great, but then over time, after the great thing gets old and outdated, everyone ends up seeing it differently and maybe even ragging on it in ways that they never used to. For instance, the first two Sam Raimi Spider-Man films were awesome and are still awesome no matter what anyone says, and I remember when those films lit the nerdosphere on fire. How dare you, the internet, reduce these iconic films to pitiful scraps of memes? Just because there's a fresh nubile young Spider-Man these days who's a doe-eyed twunk doesn't mean that you all didn't go to bat for Tobey Maguire back in 2002. I know, I was there when it happened. I don't forget, and I don't forgive. And on that note, Patty Jenkins' Wonder Woman is still a really good film too. Look, I know. Wonder Woman 1984 can generously be described as a big fucking mess. But that doesn't reach back in time to make the original film bad as well. Does it? My point is, everyone was impressed with this film when it came out, and the idea of everyone being retroactively unimpressed with it because of a different movie came out 3 years later just doesn't sit right with me. In my last video, I mentioned how Captain America Civil War improved upon its pretty frustrating source material, keeping the parts that served their purpose and repurposing the parts that didn't. So no, Iron Man wasn't going to violate human rights or clone a Thor in that film just to make sure we didn't side with his actual good arguments. Can you imagine having a character with a very complex, relatable position and then having them just randomly do terrible things so you can't actually root for them to succeed?
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Anyway, Jenkins' Wonder Woman film has a similarly give and take relationship with its source material, though not in the ways you might expect. It's not trying to fix problems with the original comics. It doesn't think that the archetypal Wonder Woman narrative needed to be turned on its head or anything, but it kinda does that anyway. As with most adaptations, this film makes big and small changes here and there from the source material, but all those surface changes pale in comparison to how the movie inverts some big takeaways from Wonder Woman's origin stories. I'll explain what I mean, and I'll also note that I think this is a good thing. I'm a big fan of Wonder Woman comics, but Patty Jenkins' film is another one of those examples I like to bring up where not being slavishly devoted to the source material can be a good thing. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, just good and interesting. I mentioned the archetypal Wonder Woman narrative, and longtime comic book readers might be aware of the open secret that Wonder Woman has been dealt pretty bad hands in what we might call the coherent continuity department over the years. Literally, who is this character and what does she even do are not always questions with clear answers depending on what you read. Some readers might even suggest that Wonder Woman's history and status quo have been so slapdash that this character doesn't really have strong identifiable narratives in the same way that characters like Superman and Batman do. It's an understandable impression, but nonetheless, those people are wrong, and she does. I'll grant that her familiar beats are not as familiar to the general audience as the last son of Krypton growing up on a farm, or the dead Waynes in their alleyway, and unfortunately DC Comics has made certain regrettable decisions through the years that complicate Diana's pretty straightforward hero's journey. But in spite of all that, there remain recognizable, recurring elements of what Wonder Woman's story is about that tend to pop up again and again no matter what version of her we're talking about. Before we dive super deeply into that though, let's talk about how the movie handles this. Jenkins' Wonder Woman is a consummate coming-of-age story. A lot of superhero films are, but this one in particular, it is all about growing up. It is about a young girl learning about the world, leaving her very comfortable but stifling childhood home in order to experience a harsher but more educational world. It's about how she reacts to this experience, this loss of innocence, whether she can learn maturity from it and let it change her for the better, or else be broken and worsened by this transition from youth to adulthood. This film's depiction of Themyscira, Island of the Amazons, is an idyllic world where nothing ever goes wrong and nothing bad ever happens other than that your mom might get angry and scold you about stuff as moms do. It is the picturesque childhood home. Diana's mother also raises her on what is basically a Disney version of the outside world. According to Queen Hippolyta, there might be dark and violent things out there beyond their home, but there are clear good guys and clear bad guys nonetheless, and all that bad stuff is actually only there so the good guys can defeat it and save the day. Mankind was, quote, fair and good, strong and passionate. Big Bad Ares is the one who messed everyone up, and we'd all be nice and vaccinated if it weren't for him. In short, Diana literally grows up as a princess from a magical land, being told fairy tales at bedtime. The impression here is very clear. She's sheltered, she's innocent, she's idealistic. Even when she's aged to maturity, she's still very childlike. Sidebar, Jenkins has mentioned that Diana is canonically thousands of years old by the time she's Gal Gadot, and I go back and forth on whether I like this choice or not. I just don't know how much sense it makes for Diana to even go through a coming-of-age story when she's already lived so long, which kind of blunts the impact of the whole growing up metaphor here. And the poetic potency of her being the odd girl out amongst all these other hardened adult Amazons is a bit diminished when she's actually about as old as everyone else here, give or take a few centuries. On the other hand, Themyscira being this timeless, static world with Diana being an inexperienced woman child who still lives at her mom's house after all these years also kind of works in the metaphor's favor. For centuries, Diana has basically been stuck in this stagnant, never-ever land existence, where time doesn't pass and nothing truly changes or even happens. She might have the years, but not the experience, and that's what makes her so childlike compared to everyone else. And it makes it all the more significant for this character to GTFO, to escape this gilded cage so she can truly mature as a person. So, good job, Jenkins? Until I decide it's not a good job again. Anyway, the plot happens, and Diana wants to go out and help mankind with their Europe-sized baggage of problems. Remember though that at this point, she thinks people out there are super great. The only reason that there's a war is because of Ares, and otherwise everyone would be getting along. And what happens through the rest of the film is that Diana is slowly but inevitably disabused of these preconceptions. Scene by scene, character by character, we see her learn about this new world where things are messy and complicated and people aren't just totally good or totally bad. This is not a storybook world, and much of the narrative from here on out revolves around how Diana, who is very much a storybook character, is influenced by this world and influences it right back, sometimes through her beautiful idealistic nature, other times through punching. Still, all of these terrible things that Diana sees, all the suffering and the warfare, only strengthens her resolve to defeat Ares, who she still thinks is responsible for all these problems. Which culminates in the third act revelation that Ares isn't responsible for all these problems, but that people do these things all by themselves. This kinda breaks Diana down, she gets her ass kicked by Ares, is driven over the edge by Steve Trevor's death, until Steve Trevor's death also drives her back from the edge, after which she atomizes Ares with the power of love. Okay, so what's the overall narrative that we just saw? Well, Diana is an innocent character who thinks the outside world is filled with innocent victims of one bad dude. She goes to the outside world only to find out that this is not actually the case. She can only end up defeating Ares by coming to terms with the truth about the world and reconciling with that truth. Cool. Let's put a bookmark on that for now and take a look instead at how Diana's origin story has been told through various other sources. There's a ton we can analyze about Wonder Woman's very original Golden and Silver Age storylines, and I do plan on doing that someday. But the stories are very dated and cartoony, and there's little point in going over every tiny nuance of how different they are from this film. They're obviously very different. But let's take a look at some of the broader points. 1940s Diana is an outsider, but she's not an innocent. She learned all about man's world from her home in Paradise Island and, in fact, knows better than us how we ought to be doing things. In contrast, the ordinary characters in these stories, good and bad guys alike, are the ones being depicted as rather childlike and wrong-headed, being in need of Diana's guidance, which sets her more in a teacher-like role. Which is kind of fitting, since Wonder Woman's creators Dr. William Moulton Marston and his wife Elizabeth Marston were both university lecturers. The stereotypical superhero power fantasy in these old stories doesn't just come from Wonder Woman's physical superiority to ordinary people, but from her intellectual superiority as well. She's just better. She comes from a better world that taught her how to do things like liberty and democracy better than the other characters here, who are in constant need of her physical and intellectual aid. Sidebar, we can see that vestiges of this interpretation do remain in Jenkins's film as a sort of out of the mouths of babes situation. Jenkins's Diana isn't portrayed as very worldly, but that in turn imbues her with a very pure, unfiltered wisdom that cuts through the cynical BS of our world. She tends to surprise the world-weary characters she meets with her insights, and there's definitely the sense that, for all her naivete, these mofos should probably be listening to her more often than not. However, compared to the Marstons' original Diana, I think there are instances where Jenkins or the writers might have still made their Diana a bit too ignorant about things. For instance, there's really not a good reason for her to not know what marriage is. I mean, yeah, this scene was charming, but if you think about it, she should probably know about marriage. Point being, Marston's Diana has no illusions about the nature of man. She knows us better than we know ourselves. Her Hippolyta never withheld any details about how cruel mankind could be. Where the movie pretty much glosses over the Amazons' enslavement by men, the comics depict it as a vital part of their history and culture. Diana enters our world with eyes wide open, but this is also tempered by a superheroic dosage of idealism and adventurousness. Things are bad, but she's here to save the day. And as for Ares, he is here and mostly referred to as Mars, but despite also being important to the overall backstory of the Amazons, he doesn't have that much to do. He's depicted as a generic villainous mastermind who wants the Axis powers to prevail so that war will cover the Earth. So ostensibly he is fueling World War II, somehow. But Wonder Woman deals with other bad guys most of the time, so her whole mission to save the world from war is not so much about him. There is eventually a prolonged storyline where Ares and his minions, conquest, deception, and greed, make trouble for Diana, and she does eventually face down Ares and defeats him with the help of her friends. But she's immediately very clear that this doesn't really change anything, and there's still a lot of work to be done if they're gonna save the world. So yeah, that there is the overall narrative of the very original Golden Age Wonder Woman. A lot of the tone and status quo of these comics will change drastically throughout the next 40-ish years, but the general story backdrop of Superwoman from Amazon Island comes to stop war and teach peace sticks around. The famous 1976 TV series cribs pretty heavily from Marston's origin story for Diana, sadly minus most of the mythological elements like Hercules and Ares. The show also retains much of the cartoonish irreverence that makes it hard to take its stories super duper seriously, no matter how important it all might be as a piece of iconic cultural media. But for our purposes, one takeaway of this series is how it starts to bridge the gap between the Diana of old and the Diana of the DCEU. See, the Queen Hippolyta of the 70s is more embittered towards mankind than her old 40s self, and openly questions if the backwards, warlike people living outside are even worth saving. Diana, in turn, is placed in the position of defending man's world through her more idealistic, youthful perspective.
Oh, Mother, how can you think that way?
I named this island Paradise for an excellent reason. There are no men on it. Thus, it is free of their wars, their greed, their hostilities, their barbaric, masculine behavior.
Thousands of years have passed. Perhaps men are now different. Perhaps they've come to think as much of peace as we do.
We shall soon see.
Can I just say, it's kind of fun to look back on this narrative progression from our vantage point as advanced future humans from the 21st century. Obviously, this dynamic will bleed straight through to Jenkins's film adaptation. At some point since the 1940s, these stories have started to question the very nature of mankind and whether they deserve to be saved at all, which, to bury the lead a bit, will become one of the big themes of Bronze Age Wonder Woman, along with being the entire thesis statement of the 2017 film. Moreover, at some point Diana has become a bit more of an odd duck amongst her fellow Amazons. She is too young to remember the atrocities they experienced at men's hands, but this gives her an even-handed clarity towards the outside world that they've lost. In contrast to her mother, who thinks mankind should just rot cause they suck, Diana's position is that mankind should be saved cause they're actually good, Mom. Hold on to that thought as well as we move just a couple of years down the line to the first true major reboot of Wonder Woman's entire storyline. In the 1980s, DC Comics did some shenanigans called Crisis on Infinite Earths. And you know what? We're not going to worry about that right now. Go away. Just know that they basically restarted Wonder Woman's series so that she had a new origin story starting in the modern day of that time. And there's so much I can say about writer-artist George Perez's reboot of Wonder Woman that it's going to have to wait for its own video. But suffice to say, right off the bat, it comes out swinging, takes no prisoners, other euphemism I can't think of. The mythological tone of the backstory gets ramped up to 120%, and so does the graphic nature of that backstory. As I mentioned, the Hercules betrayal and defeat of the Amazons is mostly glossed over in the Jenkins film, completely omitted from the 70s show, and presented kind of matter-of-factly in the 40s comics. Like, it was important, but you had to infer more about the situation than you didn't. In the Perez reboot, Hercules and his soldiers trick the Amazons, capture them, and then rape them. It is not gratuitously shown, thank goodness, but the story does not pull any punches about the fact that it happened. We're in the 80s now, and comics have changed. This is literally not your grandfather's whimsical Wonder Woman serials, nor is it the groovy adventures of Linda Carter on primetime TV. But the more things change, the more things, etc., etc. Once again, Diana is placed in the position of the naive girl out who might share the Amazons' teachings, but not their trauma. In this case, though, Diana genuinely doesn't know anything about the outside world and doesn't really have an opinion on mankind other than being dispassionately curious about them. Her mission to go out and stop Ares is more of a divine responsibility, and if she fails, all the other gods will die along with the Amazons and the rest of the world, so instead of this being something she takes on out of compassion or altruism, it's like, well, this job sucks, but somebody's gotta do it. But interestingly, when this version of Diana actually gets to man's world, she finds herself being enthralled by it all, and especially by the people. These are not the clumsy, maladjusted cartoons of the golden age of comics, or the funky personalities of the silver age. These are more rounded human beings, and they make a big impression on Diana, who, yes, is still doing most of the actual heavy lifting when push comes to shove, but instead of her being the all-knowing teacher figure who constantly has to come to everyone's rescue, 80s Diana ends up very much relying on these new friends and allies to teach her how to navigate this strange new world. Instead of the backwards warmongers that she was taught about from her upbringing, she instead finds brave men and women who are more than willing to aid her in her mission. In this context, Diana starts off thinking that mankind probably doesn't deserve her help, but they show her otherwise. Her people's preconceptions were biased, and the world should be saved because there are good people. And when she finally faces down Ares, we can see just how thoroughly the general Wonder Woman narrative has become at this point about questioning the very nature of humankind. Ares is actively spearheading man's destruction, but the only reason he's become so powerful is because mankind is so willing to follow his teachings. And we're talking all mankind, not just the Germans or any other one group. In a very clear comparison, Perez equates people being bloodthirsty and militaristic with them literally worshipping the god of war. Diana quote-unquote defeats Ares by showing him the truth that if everyone dies, he'll die too. And it all ends with Ares telling her that she better make people better than they are now, or else he will be back. And that there is the archetypal Wonder Woman narrative that mostly persists from this point forward. There will be more reboots and reiterations from here on out, shout out to the Amazing Legend of Wonder Woman series by Renee DeLiz, but the general outline of the Perez origin story will remain, along with its recurring motifs. Diana starts off as the sheltered child. Steve Trevor does his perennial belly flop onto her island, and Diana is incentivized to go out and save the world from the threat of war. Along the way, she meets and is aided by allies in man's world, including stalwart servicemen and servicewomen to stand alongside her in battles, kindly professors who satisfy her insatiable curiosity, until she is filled with the conviction and wisdom necessary to take on the forces of Ares and stop their ambitions. It's a story that's very invested in the moral aptitude of mankind, with our propensity to wage war tied directly to Ares' rise to power, and Diana is all the more determined to stop him because she's learned along the way, firsthand, that people are just inherently good and helpful and awesome. Hey, wait a minute. Isn't that the exact opposite of the movie's message? Like, the surface beats are there, and sure, these guys aren't terrible or whatever, but they certainly didn't exceed Diana's expectations for people, and whatever wisdom Diana gained during her vacation in World War I, it certainly was not about how people are actually hella great. It's almost as if these two origin stories are making very different arguments from entirely contradictory positions. And you know what? That's fine. The interesting thing about looking back at all these different versions of the same overall story is that you can see the ever-evolving advantages and disadvantages of each approach. How some things that come across as strengths in some versions of this story can become weaknesses in other contexts. As I said earlier, making Diana too naive about rudimentary things might work for the overall coming-of-age character growth metaphor, but runs the risk of also infantilizing her to a pretty silly degree. This is a legitimate problem even with Perez's take on Diana. Like, imagine if the movie had made Diana as wide-eyed and honestly as helpless in man's world as that, with Steve and his friends having to teach her everything, including how to speak. That story would be kinda patronizing. On the other hand, if you go the other way and make Diana the all-wise, all-knowing goddess from paradise who already knows everything she needs to know, you rob this character of the important process of learning and developing from her journey, which makes her relatable and human. Along those lines, if you've made it so that Diana has to learn that mankind is actually bad like the film does, then we don't really get the engagement of Diana breaking free from the prejudices of her upbringing and learning to love this world that she's been taught to scorn. The cynical Amazons are proven right, and that's all there is to it. But then, if you make it so that Diana has to learn men are actually good, you're taking away the maturity and gravitas of that rude awakening to the truth that the film honestly portrays so well. This is what I meant when I said earlier that blind dedication to the source material isn't going to make your adaptation better, but hey, if you're lucky, you also might not wind up with anything worse. It all depends on context. Maybe you think Diana's a bit too boy crazy in Marston's comics, falling for the first man she ever meets and just mooning over Steve Trevor a bit too much forever. But without that, you lose the schmaltzy, melodramatic, destined lovers angle that some people, who aren't me of course, might like about that dynamic, and then you might overcorrect in the opposite direction, and now the much older Steve Trevor's relationship with Diana is kind of weird anyway, and they only have that connection because his dead mother saved the Amazons. Anyway, the point is, adapting a story is a balancing act of trying to determine what best serves the new story you want to tell, emphasizing or toning down elements until you arrive at that proper narrative mixture. Writing anything is like that, of course, but especially when you're trying to work from a pre-existing story. Because here is what I'm absolutely not saying. I am not saying that you can just do literally whatever the heck you want when adapting a story. I mean, you can, but maybe you shouldn't. Sorry, I do not vibe with that kind of subjective mindset where all writing choices are equally valid, all adaptations are just as meaningful. But see, that is not mutually exclusive with me also saying that diametrically different elements might in fact be appropriate for different adaptations. This works here. This works here. What I have been trying to say is that I think there is plenty of room when analyzing media to say that certain choices were more or less appropriate for your story without defaulting to the pointless redundancy that everything's just a matter of opinion, man. And determining what is or isn't appropriate for your adaptation requires a solid understanding of what worked and what didn't work in the pre-existing story. Let's face it, superhero media has been filled with very strange reboots and retcons that just, simply put, did not get the point. They weren't operating from a position of understanding towards the strengths and weaknesses of their own source material, and it showed. Wonder Woman in particular, and unfortunately, has borne the brunt of this trend. Oh my god, I completely forgot about this thing. Gee, okay, you didn't even make it to air, so sorry, we're just gonna politely ignore this. So many of the notorious attempts to adapt Diana's story just end up so embarrassing because they didn't understand the strong parts of the character and they actually barely understood the weak parts either. Cause here's what I'm also absolutely not saying. I'm not saying that it is all that difficult to adapt Wonder Woman, any more difficult than it is to adapt any number of other superhero stories. That was the rallying cry for a while, wasn't it? Movie scriptwriters and comic book writers alike would whinge about how hard she is to understand and how confusing her world is, and it's like, ugh. I, a complete rando on the internet, just retold Wonder Woman's central storyline like 4 different times. So just admit you don't actually know what her storyline is and move on, Joss Whedon. This is what I like about the 2017 film, that it does approach the character from a position of understanding towards her fundamental narrative, in spite of the fact that it also totally deviates from some pretty core aspects of that narrative. Here's the thing, this is not the perfect Wonder Woman origin. This is also not the best Wonder Woman origin, and neither is this, or this, or this, or this. Each of these adaptations are building upon the bits and pieces that came before, shaping their own identity on top of the narrative foundation. Sometimes additively, sometimes destructively, sure, but always with a clear understanding of what they added or took away. And I think that's really cool, that we have these series of adaptations, one after the other over the years, slowly polishing and refining the core storyline of this amazing Amazon into something more with each iteration. I'm sure we'll get another Wonder Woman origin at some point in the future that continues to hone the edges until we do get something of a perfect Wonder Woman origin story. And then we'll get an even better one after that. Alright, well that was a fun video to make. As you can probably tell, I really like Wonder Woman, so I'm looking forward to doing more of this kind of... Oh wait. Oh no. Oh, this ending. So, what are the problems here? 'Cause there are several. One of my personal rules of thumb is that if you're going to reveal some sort of surprise twist fake-out reveal in your story, that reveal really needs to be better than the status quo that we had before it. It sounds so simple, right? Don't make something that makes your story worse. Easy peasy. But I think writers fall into this trap of making a story more complicated than it needs to be based on the questionable equation that more complicated equals more content equals more interesting equals more good. And it's risky. I've seen a lot of stories recently fall prey to this. The world building you had was perfectly workable, but you just had to toss in something to shake it up for the sake of shaking things up and making everything we already knew different, which is cool if the different thing is better than the original thing and not worse. The main problem with revealing that Sir Patrick was Ares all along is that the alternative was already fine for the purposes of this narrative, if not just flat out better. The previous scene we just saw told us that there was no Ares behind everything. Mankind started this war all on their own and Diana just has to deal with that. When you put Ares back into this specific equation, you mess with the clarity of the thesis you just presented. Now, I'm clearly a nerd, so I like that Ares is in this Wonder Woman film. He is her primary nemesis of old, and I want to see the mythological hero Diana deal with bona fide mythological shit. So, if you have to have Ares here, what I might have done is to make it utterly clear that he has nothing to do with the war effort, and the only reason he is here is to try to make Diana join him from this point forward, and that's it. But the way they do it here is that he didn't start the war or anything, but he is giving turbo poisons to the Germans so they can kill a lot more people, which is like, yeah, I get it, he's not literally making people poison people, but it's still such a wishy-washy, inarticulate way to hand-wave his involvement here. Diana finds out that Ludendorff wasn't Ares, but that some other dude is Ares, but he's an Ares that isn't manipulating mankind. Except he is kinda doing that a little, and it's just a weird, messy, waffling, ping-ponging back and forth between positions, and I can just feel the audience start to dip out. Again, be coherent about our takeaway here. Your own setup of the story, that Diana has to grapple with the reality of man's cruelty, demands that you be that firm with this setup, with the literal thesis statement of your film. Make it so either Ares isn't here, so he isn't involved with the war, or he is here, but he isn't involved with the war. The other problem with this reveal is that there's no purpose to making him Sir Patrick. You could just as well have made Ares his own distinct character, and it would make zero difference to anything. I think Jenkins was going for the sort of twist where the good character we knew was actually the bad guy all along. But do I even have to list why that doesn't work here? 'Cause I'm gonna. First off, Sir Patrick has been a tertiary character at best up to this point, and we don't actually know or like him very well, so the twist reveal of him being the secret villain is nothing. We feel nothing. It feels like a twist for the sake of a twist. Secondly, there's nothing Sir Patrick says or does throughout the film that all of a sudden makes extra clever sense if he's revealed to be Ares, like, now I understand why he gave them money for the mission. You turned one thing that made sense already into another thing that also makes sense. Huzzah. Basically, if Jenkins wanted to have an existing character turn out to be the baddie to surprise everyone, Ares should have been one of the characters who'd been traveling with Diana all this time. Then the reveal would really matter. Like, maybe set it up so there's someone amongst Steve's friends who seem to, I don't know, be super supportive of Diana throughout the film and said stuff like, Yeah, she's totally right. Ares, absolutely, Ludendorff. You should bloody kill the heck out of him. Only for us to find out that this hypothetical character has been setting her up for disappointment and secretly encouraging her to be more bloodthirsty all along, which is Ares' plan. 'Cause he's Ares. Wouldn't that be hella cool? I think that'd be hella cool. And look, I would be remiss if I didn't mention how fucking weird David Thewlis looks as Ares. I am sorry, no offense, hashtag dismantle beauty standards, all gods of war are beautiful the way they are, but does this not feel like a very bizarre case of miscasting? If the rationale was to cast someone who we absolutely wouldn't expect to be Ares, then great job. But you realize you also wrote this part of the film where we have to find him believable as Ares, right? And the Ares reveal wasn't even the only twist reveal they threw out in this scene. Diana also finds out that the sword she thought was the God Killer isn't the God Killer, but that she is the God Killer because she is secretly Zeus's daughter. In fairness, this reveal was less disruptive than the other and was set up way better. It's mostly to explain why Diana has her powers and how she alone can defeat Ares because, quote, only gods can kill gods. But it's still an example of them making the story more complicated for no reason, considering that what we had before the reveal was totally fine. The original premise, we were told, was that Zeus magically made Diana out of clay anyway, which, could explain her powers already. So the secret reveal that she literally came from Zeus sure is a step sideways? I mean, they throw in the caveat that only gods can kill gods in order for this reveal to be significant, but you didn't have to have that caveat. It's a fictional rule that you just made up right now to justify this lateral reveal. So once again, the surprise twist here is that the thing that already made sense in the first place is now another thing that makes an equal amount of sense, so we're just complicating things to fill screen time, I guess. It's not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, but I'm pretty sure they only tossed this part in order to line up with the comic book status quo for Wonder Woman at the time, which, hey, remember how I said blindly following the comics isn't necessarily a good thing? Don't even get me started on the New 52. So we already got all these weird reveals and retcons and fucking around with the story that was pretty coherent up until now, and we're not even 10 minutes into this finale. What follows is the big old CGI battle between Diana and Ares, and, well, a lot of people get put off by it because it's just the big CGI battle that we've come to expect from superhero films. But I'm okay with that. Like I said, I want to see big mythological hero shit in a Wonder Woman film. I don't think the problem with this fight is the big smashy CGI. The problem is that it really doesn't make sense. What does Ares expect to happen here? He's not gonna beat her into joining forces with him. Diana's not gonna become more jaded about people because you threw some rubble at her. Does he really just want to kill her then? So then what was the point of all this? We spent this whole scene trying to set Ares up as this cunning mastermind manipulating events and spewing his honeyed words or whatever, when really he's just gonna be an aggro weirdo if Diana says no thanks, big aggro weirdo? Not impressive. I get that we're trying to do the throne room scene from Star Wars here, more on this in a minute. But the point of that scene was that the Emperor was goading Luke into the dark side by putting his friends in danger. Everything that happens, including Luke fighting Vader, was meticulously planned. Here, there's not really any point to this battle. Ares doesn't engineer Steve Trevor's sacrifice or provoke it in any way, so it practically seems like an accident when Diana does go dark side thanks to Steve's death. Oh, hey, that worked? Yes, this was my plan all along. Yeah. To me, there's nothing wrong with a big CGI fight when it's supported by narrative coherence and strong characterizations. The problem is that big CGI fights are often used in place of those things, which gives big CGI fights the bad reputation of being incompatible with those things. The truth is that the best CGI in the world can't fix awkward writing, but strong writing can make any kind of special effects pretty engaging. If we had to have Diana and Ares do a big fight in this film, and again, I do want that, what I would have done is to put it after her epiphany about love, after she rejects killing Dr. Poison. Just take this whole earlier chunk of the battle, recontextualize it a bit, and shift it to after this point. So in my revision, I imagine the earlier part of the fight is just about Steve and his crew trying to bring down the plane while Ares just watches from the side. Then Steve does his exploding, Diana does her freakout, Ares gloats, Diana unfreaks out as before, and then we have a proper fight between them with Diana eventually reflecting his power just like in the film. We would lose the feeling of Diana being the overpowered, invincible Matrix-awoken goddess, but I don't know how much sense that made anyway, and really, this is the only part where it actually makes sense for Ares to want to finish her off and for Diana to counter in kind. It's just one idea. And then we finally get to this conclusion where Ares gets blown up, and then everyone starts smiling and hugging the enemy side. Oh boy. Honestly, all that stuff I said so far about this finale, all that stuff about unneeded twists and unneeded battles and whatnot, all those things actually barely register as problems compared to this one small moment after everything is done. You could keep all of the above as they were and still end up with a flawed finale, yes, but nothing that outright breaks the story. This part here, though, makes it empirically seem as if Ares was making everyone fight all along, and that everything is fine now that he's dead. I don't know what they were thinking, although I imagine that they think they were writing these soldiers to be relieved about surviving this apocalyptic battle, so no one wants to fight anymore and everyone's just human underneath their helmets, but man, if ever there was a scene that illustrates the indisputable power of showing instead of telling, this would be it. What we are shown here is that there is, in fact, a magical solution to the fighting, in spite of the film's whole central thesis telling us that there is no magical solution to the fighting. I don't care how relieved you are that you survived Clash of the Titans. You're not gonna laugh and hug your enemies. That just makes it seem like you're magically enchanted, or that you just got finished being magically enchanted. And come on, Chief, don't hug that guy. He's gonna turn into a Nazi in 20 years. I have small nitpicks with the previous parts of this film, but nothing major I would adjust. In contrast, this finale is unfortunately riddled with issues, and I absolutely don't blame anyone if it soured people on the overall experience. And yet, I still like this finale, and I'll try to explain why. I touched on this earlier a wee bit, but there's a problem that started to happen to Wonder Woman throughout the 90s and 2000s. She seemed hard to define for a lot of writers, and in particular, she was hard to write in contrast to other characters. Superman was the ideal noble hero, and Batman was the hardcore dark vigilante. And there seemed to be the consensus that Wonder Woman should naturally end up as the harmonious balance between those extremes. And what ended up happening was that writers really liked writing Diana as a warrior. They really liked writing her fighting. They liked writing Diana enjoying fighting. And yeah, cool. It was a valid way to differentiate her from other characters drawn from her very distinct backstory. Superman can't sword fight, and Batman in armor looks like a toy commercial. Very many of the most memorable moments for Diana from here on out will draw from that imagery of her as the Amazon warrior. You see this? To this day, Wonder Woman writers are still chasing this high. However, what also tended to happen was what we today might refer to as a standard case of flanderization, where the most memorable traits of a character get so emphasized and accentuated that it ends up as a tumescent parody of what it once was, on top of overshadowing any of the character's other traits. Through many stories, Diana wasn't just a warrior anymore, it became all she was. She didn't just enjoy the fight, rather, she didn't do anything except fight. I mean, this was the 90s and 2000s. A lot of writers turned a lot of characters edgy and extreme, and there's a lot more to all this. And someday I want to give this situation the write-up that it deserves. But for the sake of time, let's just say for now that Wonder Woman started not to feel like Wonder Woman. She was mean. She was cruel. She was impatient and warlike, and even her design turned colder and more metallic. Remember how I said earlier that adaptation is about finding the proper balance to a story, and that certain strengths of a character can become weaknesses if you overemphasize them. A Wonder Woman that only knows how to fight might be a badass monster slayer, and I don't deny that this impression will serve her well through the years. But she lacks certain other endearing traits like knowing how not to be a warrior and when not to fight. And at the end of the day, a character who has those complexities is always going to be more distinct than a character who doesn't. And that goes for everyone, not just Wonder Woman. Even now, to this day, writers seem to struggle back and forth between these worldview extremes for Diana, and it's become a bit of a challenge for them to find that happy balance for this character who can and will stab someone with a sword, but is also, by nature of her narrative, filled with the truest love for this world. The story of Jenkins's Wonder Woman is a struggle for Diana's soul. Steve's mission can succeed or fail, Ludendorff can live or die, but the actual stakes of the film are about how this all affects Diana. If Ares truly instills Diana with a permanent outlook of bitterness and anger towards mankind, that's the real game over. And that's even if she doesn't just flat out help him murder everyone. Watching Diana lose her compassion and idealism here, it's as if we're really seeing this character in real time turn into that heartless warrior woman from all those try-hard comics that tried so hard to deprive her of her better nature. Yeah, it looks badass and powerful, but at what cost? That's why this right here, this Return of the Jedi scene, is my favorite moment of this movie. Well, okay, fine, maybe second favorite. Earlier I had mentioned that Diana learns mankind is bad in this film, but that's of course oversimplifying the takeaway. Mankind is bad and good, just like Wonder Woman herself. Just like this multifaceted character who's been molded by all her origins and all her stories through the years, people are not one extreme or the other. And this moment here exemplifies Diana choosing the complexity of love over the simplicity of hatred. It's easy to want to save the world if everyone you ever meet in it is a beautiful, selfless person who will trip over themselves to help you personally at every turn. It is easy to love people when they deserve it. It is much more difficult to do so when they don't. And yet, that is what Wonder Woman is about. The angel from paradise who took it upon herself to come and save this broken, complicated world. And that message does come through in this finale, admittedly, in spite of the finale's own efforts to obscure it. And whatever else we might say about this film, I'm glad that Wonder Woman's first true live-action movie that reintroduced her to the modern audience at large ends up basking in the complexity and the balance of the character, showing her as someone who knows when to choose violence and also when to show mercy. It gives me hope that future incarnations of this character will continue to respect this careful balance so that we don't end up with angry warrior Diana all the time, so that Wonder Woman can continue to be the badass that she is without going overkill in situations that she doesn't need to. Oh, for fuck's sake! Why do people like this guy?